Welcome to another edition of Jules Voto's Photo Focus. I'm recording this in the middle of October 2024, and in 2 months it will mark 52 years that I've been shooting with Nikon. And there were some Canons along the way, and I'm going to get into that in a minute. But the purpose of this video is just to give you a rundown on how I went from actually a Pentax to Nikon to Canon, back to Nikon to Canon, and finally sticking with Nikon. And the reason I'm doing this is people have asked me, well, how come you're shooting Nikon? How come you're not shooting Canon or Sony, or even back when I was shooting film? Well, you know, the Minolta's a nice camera. So I just want to quickly go over that and explain how, when I first got started, I bought the Pentax. So I first got interested in photography. I was 14 years old in the spring of 1970. And a friend of mine who sat behind me in class in my freshman year at high school brought in some pictures he had processed at home, some black and white images. I don't remember what they were of. And I started asking him a million questions. I wrote a letter to Kodak and, eventually bought a little processing kit and was making contact prints from 126 size film. I had a Kodak Instamatic. I think it was the 124 model. And I don't know if you're familiar with that. They have been long discontinued, but it produced a 1 inch approximately by 1 inch negative. And I was making contact prints from that. But I was hooked. In early 1971, I bought my first single lens reflex camera, a Pentax H1A with a 55 millimeter f2 lens. I paid $104 for this camera at a place called Williams, Brown and Earl on Chestnut Street in Philadelphia. And I shot everything. I was so creative back then. I was trying everything. I bought the Time Life series on photography, which was a great help to me, to help me learn. I asked a million questions of anybody I saw with a camera. And following year, I think it was around June of 72, I traded that H1A in for a Pentax Spotmatic. It's my first camera with a built-in meter. Previously, I was using, I think it was a Gossen Super Pilot. So along that way, I started looking at photography magazines. I subscribed to both modern and popular photography, and there would be these great ads for cameras. I specifically remember the ads for the Minolta SRT 101. There were great pictures, great images of the camera, the lenses. Same thing with the Canon FT. So some great ads for Canon FT, and of course Nikon. And Nikon was the camera at the time, all throughout the 60s, into the early 70s, before Canon came out with a pro level camera. But they had contests every month in modern photography, and they would print 4 or 5 images, and it would give you the specs on the image, what kind of camera it was, a lens, if they had exposure information. And a lot of those images were shot with Nikon. And I remember a specific ad for the Nikon School. At the time, there was something called the Nikon School. I think it was like $20. And there was a picture of a photographer with an FTN, a Nikon FTN. And I said, God, I want that camera, right? And I was young. I was 14, 15, 16 years old, and I was very impressed with the ads. And it wasn't the smartest thing, I guess, to decide on a camera based on the ads, but I read test reports and lens reports. And so in December of 1972, I got my first Nikon camera. Actually, it was a Nicormet FTN, very similar to this one, with a 50 millimeter 1.4 lens. And I loved that camera. And I held on to the Spotmatic for a while and eventually sold that and bought more lenses. And I'm just going to check my notes here because I have so many cameras written down. But in '73, I picked up a used Nikon F. Actually, the one I bought at the time had a Photomic T finder that did not work, but it was a red dot Nikon. Those of you who are familiar with Nikon know the red dot cameras are more valuable. At the time, I don't think that was known. I think I paid $119 for that F body, and then I picked up another one that had the standard prism, as you see here. This is not that particular camera. I ended up selling that. Regrettably, I sold a lot of my equipment. And let me just real quick say something. When I went from the H1A to the Spotmatic, I traded it in. And I discourage that at this point. After all these years in photography, I have traded in cameras from time to time, but you get killed on that. If you're going to change cameras, if you decide to upgrade within a camera line or go to a different brand, don't trade your equipment in. Try to sell it. If it's really not worth that much, give it to a needy kid, give it to a family member who may be interested in photography. I would highly recommend you do that. So in 1974, I picked up a used FTN, which is the camera that I was so impressed with several years earlier when looking at those ads in modern and popular photography. And it was the camera I wanted. And it had a working meter. And I felt like a professional shooting with that camera. And I shot everything. When I tell you everything, I had my camera with me no matter where I went. I shot primarily black and white. By this time, I had set up a nice darkroom in my basement, and I loved it. So let's jump ahead now to 1981. I got married, and actually, let me just jump back a minute to 1973. I graduated from high school, and the local camera shop, which also was a photo lab, I had been going in there all the time, buying equipment, asking questions, and they hired me, and I was processing C22 at the time. This was before C41 color process. It was C22, and I was running the processing machine. Actually, I was helping someone to run. It was a dip and dunk processor. So I just loved photography. I knew that's what I wanted to do for the rest of my life, and I'm still doing it, you know, so many years later. So in 1981, I got married, and I bought a Nikon F3. I skipped right over the F2 because I couldn't afford it, and I bought the F3. So I went from a manual focus camera without a meter, the H1A, to the Nikon FTN that did have a through-the-lens meter, to an automatic camera, the Nikon F3. And I love that camera. Up to that point, that was my favorite camera that I had ever owned. And I didn't own that many up to that point. Then autofocus came out, and I believe the first autofocus I bought around 1988 was the Nikon 8008, which was a really nice camera. And then a few years later in 1990, I was working for a 1-hour photo lab at the time, managing a 1-hour photo lab. I picked up a used F4S, and that was the top of the line Nikon at the time. And I also had around that same time, an N90S. And I have an N90S here that I bought a few years ago. You could get these cameras really cheap. They are great cameras. I think when these cameras were new, they were around $800 or $900. I think I got this one for 15 bucks. So if you want a good autofocus film camera, look for an N90S. So what happened? I was working, starting in 1990, for a weekly newspaper. Got to shoot everything. I loved that job. I got to go places that a lot of people don't go. We got to do ride-alongs with the police. Shot a bunch of stuff. I what was I shooting with at the time? I had a 24, a 35, a 50, a 105, picked up an 80 to 200 zoom. And in 1992, in the spring of 1992, there was a Philadelphia Eagles mini camp in South Philadelphia, not far from the newspaper office. And they sent me down to get some pictures. And at that event, I ran into the assistant PR director for the Philadelphia Eagles. And he said, you know what, Jules, my photographer's not here today. Will you give me some pictures? And the newspaper was fine with it. So I gave him some pictures. And that was that. But a few months later, when Eagles training camp opened, I guess that was July of 92, I got a call from this gentleman. And he said, would you like to shoot the Eagles games this year? And I was like, I couldn't believe it, that I'm going to get the opportunity to shoot professional football on the field, on the sideline. And the deal was, would give me a pass for the game. They would give me a parking pass. You could go to the buffet to eat before the game and at halftime. And also could go to away games if I could get there. They wouldn't provide transportation. And for the away games, they would give me 2 passes so I could bring along a friend or a fellow photographer. And God, I loved that. I went to a game in Washington. I went to a few games, the Eagles playing the Giants and the Jets in New York, at Giant Stadium. And I did that for 2 seasons, 92 and 93. And I was shooting with the f4 at the time, and the longest lens I had was the 80 to 200 2.8. And I knew that wouldn't be good enough for professional football, so I rented a 300 2.8. And wasn't too happy with my results. I got pictures fine of the huddle, of them lining up. But once the action started and things were coming towards me, I didn't do that well. Now, I had shot high school football for several years, so I was pretty good at that. But God, the pro game is so much faster. The players are so much bigger. And you have a lot of competition on the sideline. You had to pick your spot. Excuse me. So one of those games, it wasn't the first game, maybe the second or third game I photographed, I saw a gentleman with a Canon EOS 1, which was the top of the line Canon autofocus camera at the time. And started talking to him, and he said, I was complaining a little bit about my f4. I think he owned the camera store. I think he was in the same situation as me where, he did the same thing I did, got a pass, shot the game, and you would give the assistant PR director some of the images. He wanted to see some of the images. Actually, they used a couple of my images in the yearbook and for other things, but he let me try his Canon EOS 1. He had the 300 2.8, and it was like night and day. It just picked up focus immediately. It was so much better. So of course now I wanted an EOS 1, and that's what I did. I sold my f4 and bought the Canon EOS 1. I loved that camera. It was all electronic. The lens mount was electronic. But let me digress just for a second here. One of the great things with Nikon was non-obsolescence. The camera you bought in 1959, if you bought a Nikon F in 1959, you could mount the lenses you bought in 1992. They never changed their lens mount. When they went to AI, there was a little change, but you could have your older lenses modified to work on the newer cameras, and the newer lenses worked fine on the older cameras. Where with Canon, when they went to the EOS mount, all their old lenses were obsolete. They would not work on the EOS 1, I think, or any of the EOS cameras. I think there was some type of adapter, but you lost quite a bit using that, I believe. You may not have even been able to focus to infinity, but But I'm getting off the topic here. So I just love that EOS 1. I love the quick control dial on the back. No, I don't have an EOS 1 here. I no longer have any Canon equipment other than some old film cameras. But I really love that camera. I had one issue with it one time. I was shooting the Lollapalooza concert in South Philadelphia, and it started raining, and the camera just stopped. Now, I never had that issue with a Nikon camera. But still, I love that camera. I bought additional lenses, bought another body. It was I don't even remember what it was, an EOS 20 or 30, I don't remember. But in 1994, I shot a job for the newspaper. I put the camera in the trunk because I had to go to Toys R Us to buy some clay for my son for a school project. And I got home, I opened my trunk, the camera was gone. No evidence of break-in. Insurance didn't do anything. I didn't, stupid me, I didn't have equipment insurance at the time, but I called my homeowners. Nothing. I put in a police report, but nothing. And I was going to buy another EOS. I believe the EOS 1N was out at the time. And I just couldn't afford it. So I still had some Nikon equipment. I went back and I bought a Nikon F100, which I really liked that camera. It was a really nice camera. It was kind of like a mini Nikon F5. So that was sometime in 1994. Still working for the newspaper. In 2000, we had went over to color a few years earlier. We were taking our film to a 1-hour lab and then scanning. The art director would scan the images. But we were spending a lot of money at this lab. So I spoke to them about buying a Nikon D1. And that was in 2000. And I think at the time the camera was $5,000. I was able to use most of my lenses on it. There was a crop sensor camera. I think it was 4 megapixel. I don't even remember. That camera was fine for available light work, for outdoor work, but with flash, the flash exposures were horrible. And eventually the shutter went right after the warranty ran out. We replaced the shutter. It was expensive. I don't remember how much it was. But when it was time for me to buy my own digital camera, for the first time since I had the EOS 1, I went with Canon, and I bought a Canon D30, which was their lower end camera. It was under $3,000, I believe. Oh, God, what was it? I think it was a 3 or 4 megapixel camera. I don't even remember, but I really liked that camera. But flash exposures were better than with Nikon, but still not great. And then in 2002, I got the Canon 1D, which was their top of the line, kind of equivalent to the EOS 1 film camera, but this was digital. I believe that was a 4 megapixel camera. It was excellent. I really liked that camera. Autofocus was just as good or better than the original Canon 1, EOS 1. And then in 2005, I bought a Canon 5D, which I love, low noise. It was 12 megapixel. And I still had a little bit of my Nikon equipment, but I was like fully into Canon at the time. And then in 2000, but flash exposures still weren't great. Okay, maybe it was me, but I don't think so. I just was not happy with flash exposures. I was shooting a lot of events and I needed to use flash. So in 2007, I bought a Nikon D200. Really liked that camera. And shortly thereafter, the D300 came out and I went with that camera. And then in 2008, Canon came out with the 5D Mark II, which I picked up. That was the last Canon camera I have owned, the 5D Mark II. I no longer have it. But so what I was doing, I was using the Canon for portraits, that kind of stuff. I was using the Nikon for everything else. I really like the flesh tones on the Canon. And God, I forget how many megapixels that 5D Mark II was. But it was low noise. It was a really nice camera. And, but with flash, I still preferred the Nikon. and I eventually sold that camera, picked up a Nikon 7100, and then finally in 2014 bought the Nikon D810. And once I had that D810, now that was my favorite camera of all time. An excellent camera. I still have that camera. I still use that camera for studio type work. I've done videos on that camera, and I still love it. But in early 2019, I finally went mirrorless. Nikon had introduced their mirrorless cameras in 2018. I believe it was August or September. And I picked up the Z6. And I still have it. And then also that year, I wanted something for sports and wildlife. I wanted to try to get into wildlife, mostly birds. I picked up a D500. I got it at a very good price. It was refurbished, and I was very happy with that camera. And then finally, in 2020, I picked up a Z7 refurb, and so my two main cameras were the Z6 and the Z7. And then last year, I bought what is now my favorite all-time camera, the Nikon Z8, which is superb. It's without question the finest camera I have ever owned. I've never had a camera whose autofocus was so good. Everything about it. There's really nothing I don't like about that camera, other than the battery life is nowhere near as good as it was on the D500 or the D810. So I'm back to Nikon. I've been back to Nikon now, what, since, God, 2007 when I got the D200, but still had Canons, and then eventually got rid of the Canon. You know, and I'm not sure when I got rid of the 5D Mark II. Probably maybe 2009. So now I'm fully back to Nikon, and I will not go change again. Number one, it's way too expensive. Number two, the Nikon does everything I want it to do. I have no need for another camera. Yeah, I know some of you may be thinking, well, you know, the Sony or the Canon, maybe the autofocus is a little bit better. Maybe it locks onto the subject a little quicker. And that may be true. But for almost everything that I do, the Z8 is great. It's filming me right now. I love the lenses. And I started buying back a lot of the old Nikon film cameras that I previously owned. I still don't have an F3 or an F4, but I have a lot of them. I have finally got an F2 a few years ago, and I love it. I always thought the F2 was the finest mechanical camera. And after owning it now for a few years, I don't use it a lot, but I do still believe that, although I've never owned a Leica. I've owned Canon film cameras, and I have some Minoltas and some other Pentaxes, but and Canons like the Canon FT and FTB. But I'm just very happy with Nikon. And those of you out there, I know there's been some complaints I've seen about the Z8, that it's noisy. Shoot RAW. And when you convert the images in Lightroom, make sure you select Use Camera Settings. If you do that, you will be very happy with high ISO images. The Z6 is a little bit better in high ISO situations. I've shot that at 12,800, and it's excellent. But the Z8 is no slouch. And the autofocus is simply amazing. So that's my journey. That's why I still shoot Nikon, because it does everything I want it to do. You know, sometimes we see another camera and think, oh God, this has this feature or that feature. But do you really need it? It's very expensive to change systems. You're never going to get what you paid. You're going to lose money, especially if you trade it in. So unless the camera is really letting you down, stick with what you got, whether it be Canon, or Nikon or Sony or any of the others, Fujifilm or Panasonic, they all make excellent digital cameras, excellent mirrorless cameras. And that's the future. Mirrorless is the future. Some people complain about the EVF. I love the EVF, especially shooting in dark conditions. If I go from my Z8 to my D810, let's say I'm shooting an event, and sometimes I'll bring along that D810 along with the Z6. If I go to use that D810, it's the view through the viewfinder in a ballroom or at a dinner or something. It's so dark compared to how much better you can see with that EVF. So I love the EVF. It gives you what you see is what you get. You adjust your exposure, you change your white balance, and you can see it in the viewfinder. So I highly recommend a mirrorless camera. No matter the brand, give it a shot if you're reluctant to change. If you're happy with your DSLR, fine. If it's giving you the images you want, if it's enabling you to shoot what you want when you want it, fine, stick with it. But I recommend giving the mirrorless a try. So I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope I wasn't too long-winded. I hope it wasn't boring. But people have asked me about my journey and how I started and why I still stick with Nikon. And I hope I have answered that question for those who have asked. And I'd like to hear your story. Let me know how you started, where you are now. Are you shooting mirrorless? Have you stayed with a DSLR? Or are you shooting film? A lot of people today have gone back to film. I have a nephew who loves film, and he's bought several film cameras, and that's what he likes. A lot of young people do. It's expensive. You're not going to be able to shoot as much as you can with digital. But hey, you know what? That's what's so beautiful about living in the photography world we live in today, is that we just have so many choices I never had back in 1971 when I bought my first camera. It was either a camera with a meter or without a meter. There was a Konica auto reflex camera, but basically it was with a meter or without, and obviously it was manual focus. So again, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel. And if you have any questions or comments, please leave them in the comments below. I love to answer your questions and comments. I don't always get to them. I do my best to do that. Now, I come out with a new video every Monday morning and Wednesday morning at 11 a.m. So I will talk to you next time.